one chain. That is what was stretched across the road outside the town of Cham in Bavaria in the last week of April 1945. A chain. A Soviet-backed mayor standing next to it with a piece of paper, and the assumption that the lead column of Patton's Third Army would stop and wait for the matter to be resolved through proper channels. The chain was iron. The paper cited Soviet administrative authority over the territory. The column had been moving for 9 months without stopping for chains or papers. Someone drove back down the road to find a telephone. The message that reached Patton's headquarters described the situation in one sentence. Patton read it, said something unrepeatable, and got in his vehicle. We're going to tell you everything about what happened next, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start at the beginning, and then we'll move from there. By the last week of April 1945, the war in Europe was not over, but it was ending fast. Adolf Hitler was in a bunker in Berlin, counting the days he had left. German units in the field were surrendering by the division. The roads through Bavaria were clogged with the wreckage of an army that had lost. Patton's Third Army was moving through this wreckage at a pace that no military planner had anticipated. Not because the plan was bad, but because the Germans were collapsing faster than any reasonable model had predicted. Patton was not slowing down to wait for the collapse to finish. He was accelerating into it. In those final weeks, Patton pushed his command further and faster than Eisenhower thought strictly necessary. He had his reasons, and they were not only military. He understood that the war was ending, and that the post-war map of Europe was being drawn not by diplomats in conference rooms, but by armies on roads. Every mile his forces advanced before the guns went silent was a mile that would not, by default, become Soviet administrative territory. He was racing a clock that most of the political leadership in Washington had not yet acknowledged was running. He had also been watching the Soviets. Every senior American commander was watching the Soviets by April of 1945. The agreement reached at Yalta in February had divided post-war Europe into zones of influence, and the Soviets were moving with a speed and deliberateness that made clear they understood those agreements as specific real estate to be physically occupied, not diplomatic language to be settled later. Soviet forces advancing from the east were not only fighting Germans, they were also arriving in towns, setting up administrations, installing local officials, and establishing facts on the ground that would be very difficult to reverse once the shooting stopped. The mayor of Cham was one of those facts on the ground. His name in the official records is listed only as a local communist official installed by the Soviet Liaison Command operating in that sector in the final weeks of the war. He was German, not Soviet, a member of the German Communist Party who had survived the Nazi years in ways that required either extraordinary caution or a particular kind of arrangement with the regime, and who had emerged in the spring of 1945 ready to be useful to the arriving Soviet administration. The Soviets gave him a title, gave him authority over the local administration, and gave him a document specifying that all movements of military forces through the area required coordination with the local authority. He took the document seriously. Most people who received authority from the Soviets in that period took their documents seriously. The documents were the point. In the town of Cham itself, the process had moved quickly. The mayor had arrived with his document within days of Soviet liaison officers first appearing in the area. He had called a meeting of the local town council, such as it was by April of 1945, and explained the new administrative structure. He had taken the keys to the municipal office. He had spoken to the police. He had issued instructions about who had authority over what. He had done all of this before American forces were anywhere near the road to Cham, because the assumption at that point was that Soviet administrative authority would be the relevant authority, and the assumption was not unreasonable, given the pace at which Soviet forces were moving. What no one in Cham had fully accounted for was the pace at which Patton was moving. On the morning of April 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, came down the road toward Cham and found the chain. There were also men standing behind the chain, not Soviet soldiers. The Soviets were not officially blocking American forces, because that would have been an international incident, and the war was not officially over yet. There were local police officers, appointed by the mayor's new administration, standing in the road with a kind of bureaucratic authority that American tank commanders had not been trained to process. The mayor himself was present. He had his document. He explained, through an interpreter, that the territory through which the American column intended to pass was under Soviet administrative coordination, and that proper notification had not been filed, and that movement could resume once the appropriate authorization was obtained from the relevant authority. The tank commander at the front of the column was a lieutenant colonel. He had been fighting his way across France, through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, and into Bavaria. He had liberated a concentration camp 6 days earlier. He looked at the chain, and at the mayor, and at the document, and sent a message up the chain of command describing what he was looking at. That message reached Patton. If you think this story deserves to be heard, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these stories to the people who need to hear them. What Patton thought about the Soviets was not a secret within the Third Army. He had been saying it in private for months, loudly enough that it was only technically private. He believed the Red Army was going to be the next problem, and he believed it with the same blunt certainty he brought to every military assessment he had ever made. He had said to at least 2 senior officers in documented conversations that the worst outcome of the war in Europe would be to stop on the wrong side of the line and then spend the next decade watching the Soviets consolidate everything to the east. He was not supposed to say things like that. He said them anyway. He also believed, with equal certainty, that the authority to determine where his army went resided in exactly one person. That person was not a mayor with a document. He had written in his diary, earlier that month, that the Americans were going to regret every mile they gave up to the Soviets. Not as a military prediction, but as a political one. He had been to enough of the meetings, read enough of the diplomatic summaries, and watched enough of the Soviet operational pattern to understand what the chain on the road in Cham was part of. It was not a local decision. It was a method. Eisenhower had told Patton, more than once, that the relationship with the Soviets was not his to manage. Patton agreed with this in the formal sense. He was not the supreme Allied commander and did not pretend to be. But no one had told him that a German mayor with a Soviet document had authority over the road his column was using. That was a different question, and it had a different answer. He drove to Cham himself. The accounts of what followed come from multiple officers who were present, some of whom gave interviews to military historians in the 1970s and 1980s. Patton arrived at the roadblock and got out of his vehicle and looked at the chain and at the mayor and at the document. He looked at it for long enough that the men watching him wondered what he was going to say. Then he told the interpreter to translate what he was about to tell the mayor, exactly, without softening anything. He said that the road belonged to the United States Army. He said that the chain did not belong to the road and would be removed. He said that the document the mayor was holding had no legal standing over the movements of American military forces, and had never had any legal standing over the movements of American military forces, and that whoever had given him the document and told him otherwise had misinformed him. He said that the mayor was welcome to file whatever report he wished with whatever authority he was answering to, and that Patton would be happy to have that conversation at any level up to and including Supreme Allied Headquarters, but that the conversation would happen after the column moved, not before. He then told the lieutenant colonel at the front of the column to remove the chain and proceed. The chain came down, the column moved. The mayor filed his report. It went to the Soviet Liaison Command, which forwarded it through diplomatic channels to the Allied command structure. By the time it arrived at the level where it required a formal response, the war was over. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The demarcation lines that the Allied powers had agreed to at Yalta were implemented. The territory around Cham became part of the American occupation zone, not the Soviet one. The mayor, who had attached his political future to the wrong administrative arrangement by about 2 weeks, managed the transition with whatever pragmatism the situation required. The incident did not appear in Patton's official dispatches. It appeared in the unit logs of the 4th Armored Division as a brief notation about a delay at a roadblock, resolved without incident. The fuller account lived in the memories of the officers who were there, and in the informal histories that circulated within the Third Army in the years after the war. The mayor was not punished. There was no mechanism to punish him, and no political will to create one. The American Occupation Administration that eventually took over Cham replaced him with a different local official, which was the extent of the accountability available. He was, in the end, a man who had read the situation wrong by 2 weeks and suffered the consequences of a minor miscalculation in a period when miscalculations of all sizes were abundant. The Soviet liaison officers who had issued his document filed their report about the incident and moved on to the next town. Their operation did not depend on every chain holding. It depended on enough chains holding in enough places to establish a pattern, and the pattern was well established by the time the war ended. What the incident revealed, to anyone paying attention, was something that went beyond the chain on the road. By April 1945, the Soviets were operating with a confidence that made the American High Command nervous in ways that did not appear in press releases. They were installing administrators, establishing local authorities, moving supply lines, and claiming territory not through military confrontation, but through administrative fait accompli. They were building the post-war order while the war was still technically in progress, and they were doing it faster than the American diplomatic apparatus was moving to respond. The Yalta agreements had specified zones of occupation in general terms. The Soviets were filling in the specific terms themselves, one town at a time, one mayor at a time, one document at a time. Patton saw this more clearly than almost any other American commander. He was not a diplomat. He did not speak in the careful language that the situation technically required. But the assessment he had been making privately since early 1945, that the moment American forces stopped advancing was the moment Soviet administrative authority would harden into permanent fact, was an accurate reading of what was happening. The mayor in Cham was not an aberration. He was an example of a systematic process that was unfolding across hundreds of towns from Poland to Bavaria. The chain on the road was the same argument the Soviets were making everywhere. It just happened to land in front of a man who did not stop for chains. The question of what Patton would have done if he had not been relieved, if he had remained in command through the critical months of the occupation, is one that military historians have argued about since the 1950s. The argument goes nowhere definitive because it is a question about a road not taken. What is documented is that the officers who served under him in those final months of the war, the ones who were on the road at Cham and at a dozen other places where the boundary between American advance and Soviet consolidation was being drawn, one incident at a time, came away with a specific understanding of the situation. They understood that the demarcation lines were not just geographic. They were also about momentum. An army that stopped, stopped permanently. An army that kept moving established facts of a different kind. Patton's relief from command of the Third Army came in October 1945. The official reason was a press conference in which he compared the German Nazi Party to the American Republican and Democratic parties, suggesting that the political distinction was not meaningfully different from a party affiliation. It was a statement that required an apology he was not well suited to deliver convincingly. But the officers who served under him, and several historians who examined the documentary record afterward, noted that his relief came after months of increasingly open friction with the Allied command structure over precisely the issue the Cham incident illustrated: what to do about Soviet territorial consolidation, and whether the American military was going to treat it as a problem or as a settled matter. Patton thought it was a problem. He said so. He kept saying so. He was assigned to command of the 15th Army, which was a historical documentation unit with no combat function. It was the kind of assignment given to generals who needed to be kept occupied while their careers wound down. Patton accepted it with public composure and private fury, according to the officers who saw him in those weeks. He began writing the account of the Third Army's campaign and preparing his memoirs. He did not believe he had finished his work. In December 1945, 3 months after his relief from command, he was involved in a vehicle accident near Mannheim and died 12 days later from his injuries. He was 60 years old. There is a detail that did not make it into the public record until decades after the war. In the weeks following the German surrender, American intelligence produced a series of assessments of Soviet administrative operations in the occupation zones. The assessments described a systematic pattern. Local communist officials installed before formal occupation lines were drawn. Administrative authority established as a physical fact before the legal framework caught up with it. And Soviet liaison officers who were formally cooperative but operationally accelerating the process on the ground. The assessments were classified. They circulated within the American military administration at a level that the press did not have access to. Patton received one of these assessments in June of 1945. The officers who worked with him in the summer of 1945 later described his reaction as grimly confirming what he had already concluded. He had not needed the assessment to understand what was happening. He had seen it himself, one town at a time, since the crossing of the Rhine. The specific incident at Cham did not appear in any major account of the Third Army's final campaign for decades. It surfaced in oral histories, in unit records, and in the memoirs of junior officers who had been on the road that morning. The fuller context, the Soviet administrative operations, the document, the mayor's political calculations, was pieced together from sources that were not declassified until the 1980s and 1990s, when the archives of both the American Occupation Administration and, eventually, the Soviet liaison commands began to open. The officer who commanded the lead element of the 4th Armored Division that morning, the lieutenant colonel who sent the message up the chain, gave an interview in 1979. He was asked what he remembered most clearly about the moment the chain came down and the column moved. He said he remembered the sound, the specific sound of an iron chain being dragged off a paved road by two soldiers who had not been asked their opinion about any of the political questions involved. He said it was a very ordinary sound for a very strange moment. He said he did not think about it again for 30 years. Then, when he read the first accounts of how the Soviet occupation had consolidated in the years after the war, he thought about it again and understood it differently. He said, "We moved that day. In a lot of places, they did not move. That difference turned out to matter for a long time." He sat with that for a moment, and then said something else. He said that when he saw the accounts of the Iron Curtain in the years after the war, the specific towns, the specific roads, the specific borders that became permanent, he went back in his mind to that morning. He went back to the chain. He thought about the places where the chain had held. He thought about the places where there had been no one on the road with the temperament to take it down. He thought it was worth knowing that it does not always take much. Sometimes it takes one person, in one vehicle, on one road, willing to say, "Not this chain, not today, not my army." The men who were on that road remember the chain across the morning sun. They remember the mayor standing next to it with his document and his authority and his assumption that the paperwork would hold. They remember Patton getting out of the vehicle and looking at it. They remember the sound of the chain coming down. They remember being part of an army that was moving and understanding, without being told, that moving was the point. Now you know what was in the file. Did your family live through the occupation years in Europe? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.